Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm really excited to bring you another round of science fiction and fantasy reviews. I have been reading a lot lately and it's about time I caught you up and told you what I think of these titles. All that being said, let's get started. First, let's talk about The Quantum Thief. This is a science fiction novel that follows a man named Isidore who is an incredibly intelligent person. They have a gift for deduction and are almost like a Sherlock character. At the beginning of the story, they are tasked with solving the mystery of who murdered this chocolatier. And I initially loved that premise, partially because it involved chocolate, let's be honest. But I did really like the character, just how intelligent he was. Even though he was a little bit of a deadpan character, I just thought he was very interesting. The story involves a lot of quantum theory, and admittedly some of it really did go over my head. The story does move on after the mystery, and I didn't like the rest of the story quite as much. I just found some of the narrative to be a little less interesting, but as a concept I really appreciated the story, and the parts that I did connect with I really did, and thought that there were some really funny moments. So not the kind of science fiction I would recommend to beginners, but for those of you that read a lot of science fiction and are looking for something a little bit more cerebral or heady, this is definitely an interesting one to check out. And I'm not sure if I'm going to continue on with the series. It had an interesting ending, but I think I'm going to leave it there. Next, I read I, Robot by Asimov, and this of course is the classic story of the rise of robotics. This is a story that I want to read, not because I believe I have to read classics in order to be a true science fiction reader, but because I love artificial intelligence stories so much. I was interested in seeing the origins, specifically the origins of the laws of robotics, which are established in this book, because I've read so many other sci-fi novels that reference those rules, and I really wanted to see where they first came from. For those of you wondering, no, this book has nothing to do with the Will Smith movie. It's really a collection of interconnected short stories, and I found them to be interesting, although not always the most memorable. The writing is quite straightforward. For those of you like myself that can be a little bit intimidated by classics, I did think this one was easy to get through, but again, not as memorable as I wanted it to be. But I'm still glad I read it because I do think that it really gave me a foundation in some of the other AI stories that I enjoy so much. So now I kind of know what they're referencing when they're making those nods and winks back to this classic. So glad I read it. Moving on. After that, I read Snow Crash by Neal Stephenson, and this is a cyberpunk novel that follows a man who works as a hacker, but also works as a pizza delivery boy. I think it's fair to describe this one as a bit of a satire on more classic cyberpunk novels, and I really enjoyed the setup. The main character is so full of himself. He's kind of made out to be this perfect character. He just thinks he is the best hacker ever, and the narrative is really engaging because you get to find out that he is just oh so cool. He has a Japanese sword, and the way the story is written is just very compelling. I would say that I wish the story had been shorter, because while I loved the beginning, I eventually got tired of it before the story was done. And I think that's something I kind of run into with Neal Stephenson, is that I wish his stories were shorter because I like his ideas, but I do lean towards shorter books, especially if I feel like what is in the book is just unnecessary. And that ended up being the case here. So a really cool idea that was just drawn out too long, which kind of lessened the effect of it. So that's the thing, is that I think it would have been a much more effective story, for me at least, if it had been shorter. Still very glad I read it, because while it's a newer book, it came out in the last few decades, I feel like it's almost become a classic already. And it was a fun read, just kind of needed to be shortened up. And I understand for a lot of people, Neal Stephenson is kind of known for not sticking his landings. He's kind of the Stephen King of sci-fi. So I guess I have to get used to that if I'm going to read more of his books. Next, I read a book called Redshirts by Scalzi, and this is basically a satire on the original classic Star Trek series. This follows a group of people working on a ship, and they start to notice that whenever they go on away missions, the people with the red shirts, who are basically the lowest rank, the ensigns, always seem to die on these missions, and they become really reluctant to go on these missions and will do anything anything to try to get out of them. This book is written with a lot of humor. It's definitely intended to be making fun of these classic stories, which if you're not familiar with Star Trek, that's basically what would happen, is that the main characters would always turn out to be fine because they didn't want to kill off the main cast. So there would always be this like random extra person in the background, and you knew he was going to die in the mission because no one cared about him, no one knew his name. And so I like that John Scalzi really played with that. I really like the concept of that one. If you're not familiar, I'm actually a huge Trekkie. I'm a big nerd, if you guys don't know. I kind of try to hide it on my channel, but yeah, I watch a lot of Star Trek. Not really the original, but I did watch TNG, Voyager, and Deep Space Nine were always my favorites. But anyway, going back to the book, I'll say that I like the concept, but I'm just not a big fan of satire. And this one became really, really meta. And while that can be cool in concept, I didn't really enjoy it. So it's just not my kind of story. If you really enjoy absurd science fiction, then you might enjoy this one a lot more than I did. I enjoy humor in my science fiction stories, but I still like the actual story to have a grounding in a more serious subject, and that just wasn't the case here. It just got way too silly and it just totally lost me. So not one I personally recommend. I know other people love it, but just not my personal taste. Now, switching over to fantasy, I read a novella called A Dead Djinn in Cairo by P.D. Djèlí Clark, and this is a story set in an alternate history of Egypt where they've discovered that the gods exist, and in this world they have to set up government organizations that are involved in policing these djinns and other gods. And so the story follows someone who is investigating the death of a djinn, as the title would suggest. I really enjoy the mystery aspect to it because I am someone who really enjoys mysteries. I don't read them as much as I wish I did these days, but I thought the concept was really cool. The actual story was a little bit forgettable, and I don't think it's one I'm going to reread, but what it did remind me is that I really like fantasy with a Middle Eastern setting, but I feel like I haven't read any of it. So if you do have recommendations for your favorite fantasy stories that are set in Egypt or the Middle East or anything like that, definitely let me know. I need to read more of them, and this book just got me excited to kind of try more of that subgenre, for lack of a better word. Finally, I decided to start reading a classic of the fantasy genre, and that of course is The Witcher. Now, for those of you that are big fans of the Witcher books, you're all going to be telling me that I hopefully should have started with The Last Wish, which is the first short story collection. And I'll let you know that over the years, I have tried reading this book. I have picked it up, I've read a few of the short stories, and I always end up putting it down. And that's just the fact that I personally really struggle with short story collections when it comes to fantasy and science fiction. They're just not my format. I find that you don't get enough world building, you don't get enough characterization, and especially for me, I really like a larger overarching plot, and you just don't get that in a short story, so I found these to be very unsatisfying. However, I did watch the first season of The Witcher, and I really like that. I also have watched and played part of The Witcher 2 and part of The Witcher 3. I want to get back to them. I just don't have a lot of free time because I choose to prioritize booktube and reading. But I do like the world. I like Geralt, I like Circe, and I am intrigued by all this, but I just was struggling with this. So I'm going to do something that all of you are going to be really upset about, and I decided to just go ahead and start with Blood of Elves. And I do realize that you do need the foundations of the short stories in order to understand the world, because this book takes no time in explaining the characters or the background or the magic or anything like that. It really throws you in and assumes that you read the short stories. But because I did watch the first season of The Witcher, which roughly follows those short stories, I felt like I had enough background to jump into this one and I wasn't confused. I did find it enjoyable. I really like the Polish setting, the European-inspired Polish setting, I should say. It's in a fantasy world. But of course, Geralt is a monster hunter, and I definitely liked the aspect of him having to protect this young girl. So enjoyed the plot, but it's not a personal favorite of mine. I don't think I would have loved this book if I hadn't already loved and watched the TV show and gotten familiar with the video games. So it's one that was comforting and familiar because I already kind of like the franchise around it. But as a fantasy book, I find myself preferring books that have more untraditional settings and are just a little bit more unique. And this one just felt very classic to me, despite the fact that, again, it's more Eastern European. it still felt European to me, and it just didn't fully hold my attention at times. I continued on, and at this point of recording this, I've also read Time of Contempt, which I liked a little bit less. I've heard that Baptism of Fire is much better, so I do plan on continuing on with the series. And probably by the time you're watching this, I'll be a lot further in, because it always takes me a little bit of time to get my videos edited and uploaded to all of you. But enjoying this series. Not one I'm gonna put on my favorites list, but definitely glad to experience it, and I really do enjoy the characters, the world, and all of that. So I'm glad I'm finally trying it out for myself, because everyone else on BookTube loves the Witcher books. So that is it for this video. Let me know down below, of the books I mentioned, which ones are you most interested in picking up. Also, recommend me your favorite desert or Middle Eastern fantasy inspired books, as well as your favorite science fiction classic, because I probably should read a few more of those. I think I would really like to continue to get my foundations in the genre as I get deeper and deeper into it. And otherwise, if you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I do read science fiction and fantasy, as well as horror and thrillers. If you are already subscribed, thanks for sticking around. Give me a thumbs up, hit that notification bell, and share this video around online. Thank you. All right. Okay, bye-bye.